What happens when Hollywood's golden boy faces a talk show host with a vendetta, sharp enough to cut through a career built on charm? Brad Pitt, the man who's dodged scandals and won hearts for decades, walked onto Jimmy Kimmel's stage expecting a routine interview, but what unfolded was a verbal brawl that left America stunned. The air crackled with tension before a single word was spoken, as Kimmel's smirk hinted at something sinister brewing beneath his usual playful facade. Pitt, dressed in a tailored suit, his jaw tight, sensed the trap, but stepped into it anyway. His eyes locked on Kimmel like a boxer sizing up an opponent. The audience, packed with eager fans, had no idea they were about to witness a clash that would dominate headlines. Kimmel, known for his sharp tongue, had been nursing a grudge, one rooted in a long-forgotten slight from years ago when Pitt, at the peak of his fame, unknowingly humiliated him at a private Hollywood event. That night, Kimmel's ego took a hit he never forgave. And now, with the cameras rolling and millions watching, he saw his chance for revenge. The show began innocently enough, with Kimmel tossing out his usual warm-up jokes, but the crowd could feel the edge in his voice. He leaned forward, his grin more predatory than friendly, and launched into Pitt without warning. "So, Brad, you've been in the game forever, right? Ever get tired of pretending you're still the guy from Fight Club? I mean, come on, you're pushing 60, pal." The audience gasped, the jab landing like a sucker punch. Pitt's smile froze, his fingers tightening on the armrest. He wasn't here to be mocked, especially not by a guy who'd built a career on snark. "You want to talk age, Jimmy? At least I'm not riding the same tired shtick for 20 years. Pitt fired back, his voice low but cutting. The crowd erupted, some cheering, others shifting uncomfortably. Kimmel's eyes narrowed, his plan to rattle Pitt already backfiring. He wasn't about to let Pitt steal the moment. "Oh, big shot's got a mouth now. Tell me, Brad, how's it feel to coast on your looks while real actors grind?" The accusation stung and Pitt's face flushed. He leaned forward, his voice steady but laced with venom. "Real actors? You're a comedian, Jimmy. Stick to telling jokes, not judging." "Talent." The audience was hooked, their murmurs growing louder as the exchange escalated. Kimmel, sensing he'd struck a nerve, doubled down. He pulled out a dog-eared gossip magazine, waving it like a weapon. "Let's talk about your golden boy image. This says you walked out on a charity event last month, left kids waiting for you. True or not?" Pitt's jaw clenched. The story was a lie, twisted from a scheduling conflict, but Kimmel knew that. He dug up the rumor to paint Pitt as a heartless star, banking on the audience's shock. "You know it's garbage, Jimmy. You're scraping the bottom of the barrel now," Pitt growled, his voice rising. The crowd was split, some booing Kimmel, others whispering about the accusation. Pitt wasn't just fighting for his reputation. He was fighting a narrative Kimmel was crafting on live television. "Scraping? Me? You're the one who's been dodging accountability forever," Kimmel snapped, his voice dripping with contempt. He leaned closer, his finger jabbing the air. "You think you're untouchable, Pitt?" "Not tonight." Pitt stood, his chair scraping the floor, the sound echoing through the studio. The audience held its breath, sensing the breaking point. "You want to play dirty? Let's talk about you, Jimmy. How you've been milking that old grudge because I didn't kiss your ring at some party years ago. Grow up." The revelation hit like a bombshell. Kimmel's face twitched, his composure slipping as Pitt exposed his pettiness. The crowd roared, some in shock, others in support of Pitt's defiance. Kimmel, caught off guard, scrambled to regain control. "You're delusional, man. This is my show, and I say what's real," he shouted, his voice cracking. Pitt didn't back down, stepping closer to the desk, his presence commanding. "Your show? Then act like a host, not a bitter wannabe." The tension was unbearable, the studio electric with anticipation. Security hovered at the edges, unsure whether to intervene. Kimmel, red-faced and fuming, slammed his hand on the desk, ready to unleash his next move as the show cut to commercial, leaving America hanging on the edge of their seats. Back from the break, the studio buzzed with nervous energy, the audience still reeling from the explosive first round. Brad Pitt stood near the desk, his stance defiant, refusing to sit back down like some chastised guest. Jimmy Kimmel, his face a mask of barely contained rage, gripped his cue cards so tightly they crumpled. He wasn't used to being called out, especially not on his own turf, and Pitt's jab about the old grudge had hit too close to home. The crowd's mixed reactions, some cheering for Pitt, others egging Kimmel on, only fueled his determination to take control. He tossed the cards aside, his voice sharp as he restarted the attack. "You think you can waltz in here, Brad, and turn this into your show? Let's talk about your so-called philanthropy. All those photo ops with orphans, just for the cameras, right?" The accusation was vile, twisting Pitt's years of charity work into a publicity stunt. The audience gasped, some hissing at Kimmel's low blow. Pitt's eyes blazed, but he kept his voice steady, each word a dagger. "You're pathetic, Jimmy. Digging up lies to make yourself feel big. I've spent years building schools, homes, lives. What have you done? Mocked people from behind a desk?" Kimmel laughed, a harsh, grating sound that made the crowd flinch. He stood now, matching Pitt's height, though his presence felt smaller, more desperate. "Oh, spare me the saint act. You're no hero, just a guy who buys his way out of guilt." The personal jab cut deep, hinting at Pitt's private struggles, ones the public only whispered about. Pitt took a step closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You want to talk guilt? How about the time you tanked a young comic's career because he outshone you at a roast?" "Yeah, I heard about that." The audience erupted, stunned by the accusation. Kimmel's face paled, the truth of Pitt's words stinging more than he'd admit. Years ago, a rising comedian had humiliated Kimmel at an industry event, and Kimmel's quiet influence ensured the guy never worked again. It was a dirty secret, one Pitt had no business knowing, let alone airing on live TV. "You're out of line!" Kimmel roared, his voice shaking with fury. "You don't get to come here and rewrite my story." The crowd was on edge, some shouting Pitt's name, others hurling insults at Kimmel. The host, desperate to regain the upper hand, leaned into his microphone, his words dripping with venom. "You know what, Brad? You're a has-been. Your movies bomb, your charm's fading, and you're too stubborn to see it." Pitt's fists clenched, but he didn't swing. Instead, he smiled, a cold, calculated grin that unnerved Kimmel. "A has-been? That's rich coming from a guy whose biggest achievement is a man-on-the-street bit. You're not even in my league." "Jimmy!" The audience roared, the energy tilting in Pitt's favor. Kimmel, flustered, tried to pivot, grabbing a photo from his desk, a paparazzi shot of Pitt looking disheveled after a long night. "This is you, Brad, washed up, clinging to relevance." Pitt snatched the photo, glanced at it, and tore it in half, tossing the pieces at Kimmel's feet. "Keep your trash, Jimmy. I don't need it." The crowd went wild, the act of defiance cementing Pitt as the night's hero. Security edged closer, their presence a silent threat, but Pitt didn't. Kare. He was done playing Kimmel's game. "You invited me here to tear me down, but you're the one looking small," Pitt said, his voice calm but lethal. Kimmel, cornered, lashed out. "Get off my stage, Pitt. You're done." The audience booed, their loyalty shifting as Kimmel's pettiness became undeniable. Pitt didn't move, his stare pinning Kimmel in place. "You don't get to decide when I'm done," he said, his words carrying the weight of a man who'd faced worse and come out on top. The standoff stretched, every second electric, as Kimmel realized he'd underestimated his opponent. The show cut to another break, the tension unresolved, but Pitt's defiance had turned the tide, leaving Kimmel scrambling to salvage his crumbling authority. The commercial break ended, and the studio felt like a powder keg, every eye on Brad Pitt as he stood tall, unshaken by Jimmy Kimmel's attempts to tear him down. Kimmel, now visibly rattled, adjusted his tie, trying to reclaim his swagger, but the crowd wasn't buying it. Their cheers for Pitt echoed, a wave of support that seemed to physically push Kimmel back in his chair. He forced a laugh, but it was hollow, his confidence eroding under Pitt's unrelenting gaze. Determined to flip the script, Kimmel leaned forward, his voice oily with false sincerity. "All right, Brad, let's switch gears. You're a producer now, right? Bet that's just a fancy way of saying you cash checks while others do the work." The crowd groaned, sensing the cheap shot. Pitt's lips twitched, not in amusement but in disgust. "You really don't get it, do you, Jimmy? Producing's about building something real, not tearing people down like you do every night." The audience clapped, their approval a stinging rebuke to Kimmel's tactics. Kimmel's smirk faded, replaced by a scowl. He wasn't used to losing, and Pitt's refusal to crumble was driving him to the edge. "Building something? Like that flop of a war movie you bankrolled last year? Heard it tanked so bad they're using the reels for kindling." The jab was cruel, aimed at a project Pitt had poured his heart into, a film about veterans that hadn't found its audience. Pitt's eyes darkened, but he didn't flinch. That movie told stories that mattered. Stories you'd never understand, Jimmy, because you've never risked anything but your ego. The crowd roared, some standing in support, their applause drowning out Kimmel's attempt to interrupt. He slammed his fist on the desk, his voice rising to a shout. "Don't lecture me, Pitt. You're a relic, coasting on old glory while the rest of us actually work." The accusation fell flat, the audience now firmly on Pitt's side, their boos aimed squarely at Kimmel. Pitt stepped even closer, his voice low and deliberate, each word cutting through the noise. "Work? You call this work? You sit here, night after night, picking fights with people who can't fight back. I'm here now, Jimmy, and I'm not backing down." The studio erupted, the energy seismic as Pitt owned the moment. Kimmel, desperate, tried one last dig, pulling out a rumor about Pitt's personal life, a tabloid story about a supposed feud with a co-star. "What about this, Brad? Trouble on set, huh? Sounds like nobody can stand working with you." Pitt laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that silenced the room. "You're out of moves, Jimmy. That's an old lie, and you know it. You're so obsessed with dragging me down, you forgot how to do your job." The crowd cheered louder, some chanting Pitt's name, their support, a tidal wave. Kimmel's face twisted, his control slipping completely. "You think you're better than me? Get out! You're banned from this show!" he screamed, pointing toward the exit. The audience booed, their anger now a wall of sound against Kimmel. Pitt didn't budge, his presence a quiet storm. "You don't ban me, Jimmy. I walk away when I'm ready." He turned to the audience, raising a hand in acknowledgement, their cheers washing over him like a victory cry. Security moved in, but Pitt waved them off, his calm authority stopping them in their tracks. "I'm not done yet," he said, turning back to Kimmel. "You wanted a fight, you got one, but you're the one who's finished." The crowd was on its feet, the studio shaking with their approval. Kimmel, humiliated, sank into his chair, unable to muster a response as the show lurched toward its final break, Pitt's defiance leaving an indelible mark. As the final segment began, Brad Pitt stood center stage, the audience still buzzing from his unyielding stand against Jimmy Kimmel's onslaught. Kimmel, slumped in his chair, looked like a man who'd lost a war he started. His attempts to humiliate Pitt had backfired, turning the crowd into a sea of support for the actor. Pitt, sensing the shift, decided to take the high road, but not without one last blow. "You know, Jimmy, I came here to talk about my work, my life, maybe even have a laugh. But you made it personal. You made it ugly. That's on you." The audience clapped, their respect for Pitt's restraint palpable. Kimmel, desperate to save face, tried to pivot, his voice weak. "Hey, it's just entertainment, Brad. Don't take it so seriously. But the crowd wasn't having it, their boos drowning out his excuse. Pitt shook his head, his voice steady but firm. Entertainment? No, Jimmy. This was you settling a score, and you lost. Pitt turned to the audience, his demeanor calm but powerful, like a general addressing his troops. I've spent my life telling stories, lifting people up, trying to make a difference. This guy, he gestured at Kimmel, thinks tearing people down is a personality. Don't let him fool you. The crowd erupted, some standing, their cheers a thunderous endorsement. Kimmel's face burned red, his hands shaking as he tried to interject. You're full of it, Pitt. This is my show, my rules. But his words were swallowed by the audience's roar, their loyalty now fully with Pitt. He didn't need to shout. His presence spoke louder than Kimmel's tantrum ever could. Your rules? Look around, Jimmy. Nobody's listening to you anymore, Pitt said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. Kimmel, cornered and humiliated, made a final, reckless move. He stood pointing at Pitt, his voice shrill. You're nothing without your fame, Brad. Nothing. The desperation in his tone was pathetic, and the audience turned on him, their boos a relentless wave. Pitt didn't take the bait. Instead, he smiled, a genuine warmth breaking through his intensity. Fame? I don't need it, Jimmy. I've got my work, my family, my purpose. What do you have? The question hung in the air, unanswered, as Kimmel sank back into his chair, defeated. The audience's applause grew deafening, a celebration of Pitt's triumph over Kimmel's bitterness. Security stood frozen, no longer a threat, as Pitt's victory was clear. With the show nearing its end, Pitt took a step toward the audience, his voice softening but resonant. Thank you for having my back tonight. This wasn't about me. It was about standing up to bullies who think they can push people around. We're better than that. The crowd rose to their feet, their cheers, a final triumphant roar. Pitt gave a nod, a gesture of gratitude, and walked off the stage, his head high, leaving Kimmel alone under the harsh glare of his own failure. The host tried to muster a closing quip, but his voice cracked, and the audience's attention had already left with Pitt. The cameras cut, but the story was far from over. Across America, viewers would talk about this night for weeks, not because of Kimmel's cheap shots, but because Brad Pitt had faced a petty tyrant and walked away a hero, his legacy stronger than ever.